Thank you, Ed. Good evening, everybody. I have to refer to my notes so that I don't go over the short time I've been allotted. It's rare that I have the pleasure of introducing a speaker, and I don't want to squander this occasion, or Eric's time for that matter, by going on too long. And trust me, if I were to mention every achievement in Eric's career thus far, it would be a very, very long presentation indeed. So what I want to do is give you super brief background on Eric's achievements, and then tell you a little bit of a personal story about how I got to know and become friends with Eric. So the basic professional stuff first. Eric is Executive Vice President at the Aspen Institute. He's responsible for institutional advancement and governance. Prior to joining the Institute, he held important positions at the Department of State and in the White House under George W. Bush. Eric, you're probably glad you're not a federal employee today. But that's
for many reasons.
Eric serves on numerous boards, including the James Madison Council of the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian's National Council. He's a member of the Grolier Club, and he is a collector of first editions and rare books, focusing in particular on the work of Samuel Johnson. And now we're getting a little closer to how Eric and I are connected. Eric and I had met at various Grolier Club events over the years, but about 10 years ago, I got a call from one of our board of directors members, Mike Nadoff. Sorry he's not here tonight. And he said, "Hey, Eric Motley is in town. Could you give him a tour of the Rosenbach?" I said, "Sure, I'd be delighted." So Eric came over, and I can tell you that I dutifully led him through all of the spaces. But let me tell you, Eric gave me the tour as we pulled books off the shelves. His knowledge is prodigious, and his passion for rare books is really contagious, which is just the way we like things to be. So we met for coffee a year or so after that at Eric's office in Washington, and we've met almost every year since. Sometimes it's in Washington, sometimes it's in New York at a book fair, sometimes it's in other places. I remember a particular episode in 2015. I was getting out of a taxi in front of Sotheby's in New York and arriving for a very important sale of books, and I was just going in. Eric was already on his way out, and he had this look on his face, this smile from ear to ear that just telegraphed, "I got an incredible treasure today." And he did, actually, several probably. But I think the most important anecdote I have, the kind of aha moment. I love to read the New York Times on Sunday mornings, like many of you probably, and sometime in late 2017 I was reading the book review, and I came across a series of questions the editors had posed to the great author and figure Walter Isaacson. One of the questions was, "What is the last great book you read?" Would you like to know that? What Walter Isaacson thinks? So here was his answer. "I was blown away by Madison Park, a book just written by a colleague of mine, Eric Motley, about growing up in a tight-knit African-American enclave of Montgomery, Alabama, that was built by a group of freed slaves led by his great-grandfather." I saw Eric at a series of lectures in Philadelphia and then at a book fair in New York soon after reading that, and we started begging him then, "Eric, please come and talk to us about this legacy." And we're thrilled that he's accepted our invitation to speak about his book, but also about the legacy of the 13th Amendment. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming my friend, Eric Motley.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I left here after that first visit with such a smile, such elation, and everyone was just staring at me. There was this glow about me after going through and seeing the Milton and one of the great Beethoven operas, and going through the Marianne Moore collection, and even pulling some Boswell from the shelf. I mean, if every one of your speakers that you invite is a lover of books like I am, you're doing extremely well. But I was so elated on that visit that Derek pulled me aside and checked my pockets afterwards to make sure that I was not leaving with more than the elation that I was feeling in heart and mind. It's a real pleasure to be a part of this series. It's a real pleasure to be in this jewel of a space. It is a very special place for many reasons, and to be bookended by the Rosenbach brothers is to be reminded of the preservation, the conservation, and the importance of being great stewards and trustees of history and ideas. And this institution is the embodiment of that in so many ways. And when you think about the succession of ideas and passing from one generation to the next, legacies of ideas and objects, this is not just a sanctuary, but a real research haven for scholars and people who want to come. So I'm really honored to be here. Thank you so much. You know, in 1862, remarkably so, Abraham Lincoln decided to retreat for one long weekend in December to go to a cottage which is now called the Lincoln Cottage that I would encourage you to go to. And that was long before there was a Camp David. This was the president's retreat in Soldier Cemetery right in Washington, D.C., just on the parameters. And at a table that's still there, he sat down and he started to compose a letter to Congress. And I guess it would be akin to the State of the Union. And in this letter, in 1862 of December, there were phrases that he just kept reiterating. And they will always remember. They will know. History will remind them of what we did here. They will always remember our responsibility and the charge in which we've been given. And then he goes on to say, interestingly and beautifully, that when we give freedom to the enslaved, when we give freedom to the slave, we're also giving freedom to the freed. That freedom from something is not enough, it should be freedom for something. Freedom is opportunity, freedom is hope. And then he comes to the very end of that beautiful letter to Congress. I don't think State of the Unions even compare to the prose and the rhetoric of Lincoln, but he goes on to say, we nobly give or we meanly lose the hope of our generation and the greatest hope of earth. So I tell you a story about hope, a story about a place, a story about a group of people who had hope. Not long after that, 2 years later, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. And of course, in 1865, the 13th Amendment was actually ratified. And unfortunately, Lincoln did not live long enough to see that. But in 1880, I tell you this story, a group of freed slaves, newly liberated, celebrating their prospects of being able to make their own decisions for once, decided to organize themselves in Montgomery, Alabama, led by one slave who could read and write, and his name was Eli Madison. Eli was the name that his mother gave him. Madison was the name of his master. And Eli was so demanding that even his slave master was afraid of him. He learned to write and to read, and so that was that wonderful gift of empowerment. And Eli called about 6 of his friends together who had grown up on this plantation with him and invited them to pursue this great American idea of freedom, of hope. And perhaps someone had said to Eli, or Eli had heard of this idea of the American dream, or maybe Eli read that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so Eli and these 7 slaves purchased a very small piece of land in Montgomery, Alabama. They worked that land selling cotton and livestock. And eventually they were able to buy a larger plantation in 1880 called the Maize Plantation. And the first thing that they did on a very early spring morning in 1880, April, was they gathered in the open park and they said a prayer. And they made a commitment to one another on God's green altar that they would form community, that they would pursue and live into the fullness of community. They wanted to know what it really meant to be an American. They wanted to discover this idea of what an American dream could be like. And these individuals with nothing except the clothes on their back, aspirations and dreams and hope, decided that they would make a commitment by inviting other freed slaves who wanted to enterprise and become a part of this new American frontier. Now, this is what we know. We know that it was the first plantation purchased by freed slaves in the South. We know it was the only plantation that was ever acquired by slaves and operated by slaves that still exist in the state of Alabama. And they call that place after Eli, Madison Park. Now, as interesting as that story is in itself, a group of freed slaves, nothing except the clothes on their backs, their dreams or hopes and aspirations of what it could be like to be an American, to fulfill their own sense of community, never having owned anything themselves, having been owned all of their lives. As interesting and as compelling as that is, it's interesting and compelling to me because my grandfather's grandfather was one of those 7 pioneers who helped to establish Madison Park. John Wesley Motley was given his own little acreage of land in this new plantation. And there my grandfather, named by his own grandfather, named George Washington Motley, to remind him of his own responsibility and the heritage and the legacy that he was inheriting. George Washington Motley, my grandfather, remembers only 2 things about visiting his grandfather in that old house on that plantation in the 1920s. He remembers that over the front door was a cross. John Wesley Motley was a carpenter, having built this small house, but also having built a cross to remind him that there was a creator who believed in him and who had purposed him to live into the fullness of his being. Over the back door, there were only 2 doors, and there were only 3 rooms. Over the back door was an image of Abraham Lincoln. My grandfather remembered that it was an image that had been torn from a newspaper, and a very primitive frame had been built around it. A reminder how God uses individuals to inspire a difference and to make a difference in one's life. The great emancipator at the front door, the creator himself, and the human emancipator over the back door. And so what did George Washington Motley learn from his grandfather? He learned to live in community. He learned, as a farmer would teach one, to plant seed and to nurture it and to watch it grow and to cultivate and to harvest and to share with one's neighbors. He learned the responsibility of being in community and relating to those who were also on the plantation. So there's an intersection with Abraham Lincoln, with George Washington Motley, with his grandfather John Wesley Motley, and with Eric Motley. You see, George Washington Motley and his wife Mamie Motley never had kids of their own. They lived in this wonderful community that was founded by those early settlers. And they lived with neighbors and friends that they worshiped with and exchanged ideas with every day. And then one day, in the 1960s, one of their neighbors, the Perrys, 14 kids, called them and asked if they would come over for a serious conversation. George and Mamie is my grandmother, who reminded me always, like Eisenhower. They went over to the Perrys, and Bernice informed them that she had been told by the doctor that she was soon to die. She had breast cancer, and it was untreated. And so they asked the Motleys if they would consider adopting one of their children. And you know, there's so many unanswered questions in life. How do you even decide what one child out of 14 children to give up and to surrender? But they felt that this daughter had some potential, and they knew that by placing them with the Motleys, who had wanted a child but never had the benefit of having a child, would nurture this child in such a way that the child would blossom and develop into her own being. Well, she did blossom. She was 9 years old, and 9 years later, she blossomed with a bundle of unformed possibility. And if you're kind of slow, that means she was giving birth to me. She was single. She was in high school. She was uncertain of her own future. She had been taken from her siblings and moved into a house, and for the first time in her life, she was able to have her own dress, to sleep in her own bed and not compete for food at the table. And all of a sudden, she found herself with child. And George and Mamie Motley embraced her all the more, and they embraced his child. And in many ways, I think George Washington Motley believed that this was his great opportunity, his great experiment to nurture the seed and to help the community to engage in nurturing the seed, to see how the seed could be harvested and how the seed could blossom. He had 3 great desires for me: that I would realize that I was no less than the trees and the stars, that I had a right to be here, that I was created by a God who believed in me and had a purpose for me. His second great desire was that I realized that I was a part of a community, that I was a part of something much more than the Motley household, but I was a member of the Madison Park community, that I was a citizen of the world. And his last great desire was that I would realize the benefit of enlightenment that only an education could provide. They wanted to have the first member of our family to go to college, one of the first people in the community to go to college. My grandparents were so committed to my going to college that any time they saw anyone at the grocery store with a sweatshirt on that said University of Wisconsin, they would engage them in conversation. And I remember on one occasion my grandmother stopping some guy getting bananas and saying to him, "You went to the University of Wisconsin. Could you talk to our little boy? He wants to go to college." And the guy looked at my grandmother and he said, "Ma'am, I got this shirt at a yard sale. You know, I've never gone to college. I didn't finish high school." And she said, "Just smile at him. Just smile at him." And so my grandparents realized that in community, that we're all a part of what Martin Luther King calls that inescapable network of mutuality, that we're all tied in this single garment of destiny, that we're all responsible, that we'll all be held accountable, that freedom to one who is enslaved is freedom for everyone. And so they invited all the citizens of Madison Park to engage with them in the raising of this little child. I was known as Duke, the designated university kid. And everybody in Madison Park thought of me as Einstein. And I'm not convinced that anyone really knew what Einstein had done, but they knew he was an impressive individual. Until I got to first grade. And the teacher wrote a note home to my grandmother. You see, I had been in the accelerated reading groups. This is before there was political correctness. And I was in the rabbits. And the teacher wrote a note home to my grandmother informing her that I had slipped in my literacy and that I had been demoted from the rabbits to the turtles. And my grandmother's not one to discriminate, but she knows the difference between rabbits and turtles. And so she found the only person in the community that she thought could help remedy the situation. Emma Madison Bell, the granddaughter of Eli Madison. She was a retired teacher. She was muscular in every way, both in physique and in spirit and in confidence. She had been retired already 52 years, and she was 81 years of age. And she came over to that house that afternoon. She took the letter that my grandmother gave her, and she asked that I be excused, and I went to the kitchen, and I kept my ear pressed to the door, and she started to talk to my grandmother about how we could resolve the situation. And I kept hearing her repeat over and over and over, "We believe in resurrection. He will be resurrected." And in a small town where you go to church every Sunday because there's nothing else to do, I knew that before resurrection was crucifixion. And I became greatly concerned about my prospects. Aunt Shine called me back in, and she said, "We will remedy the situation. You'll be resurrected." 2 days later was Sunday. Small town, think Lake Wobegon, or maybe don't think Lake Wobegon. But we were in church. Aunt Shine had said something to the minister. He called her forth, and like giving a public address announcement, she stood before the entire congregation and she said, "Brothers and sisters, we have a problem." Little Eric Motley, sitting next to his grandmother here on the front row, was a rabbit, but became a turtle last week. But we believe in resurrection. And even now I hear the chorus of amens. We believe in resurrection. Amen, sister, we believe in resurrection. But we also believe in community. And I'm going to help Eric Motley learn to read. And this afternoon, I'm going to sit on the back porch with his grandparents at 34 Motley Drive. And I invite all of you to bring whatever reading matter you have at home by the Motley's house because we're going to build him a library. Now you understand my love for a library, Derek. And that afternoon, you would have thought a paper drive was taking place at the Motley house. Someone brought by a 1945 copy of an almanac predicting weather for that year, a 1972 Jet magazine, a couple of Life magazines, an Ebony magazine. Someone brought by volume L of Encyclopedia Britannica. Whatever you want to know about anything that begins with an L, I'm your guy. But someone also brought by a beautiful volume of English verse, minus its table of contents and index, but richly sewn with the verse of Keats and Byron and Yeats and Shakespeare and William Wordsworth and Robert Frost. And my grandfather turned to the frontispiece, and there was an excerpt from William Wordsworth's Intimations of Immortality. And my grandfather read it aloud to me. And he helped me to write every word down. A useful, very useful strategy when you can't afford books. And at dinner every evening, I had to stand and recite some verse, always starting with that Intimations of Immortality. There was a time when meadow, grove, and stream, and every common sight to me did seem, apparelled in the freshness of a dream. As it were, it is no more. The rainbow comes and goes, and lovely is the rose. And this I know where'er I go, that there has passed away a glory from the earth. And Aunt Shine did much more than build me a library. She invited her 3 retired sisters, who were also teachers, to come by the Motley household, and every day for 2 years they would tutor me. And we cleared the dining room table. Aunt Shine would stand superintending, and she would say, "Motley, stand and give me the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident." Louder, more assuredly. "Your grandfather's grandfather was a slave who came in search of his freedom. He was emancipated. He had dreams and hopes and aspirations to build a place for you so that your future could be brighter and filled with hope. Own it. All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain what? Inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And who wrote that, Motley? Thomas Jefferson. And who is he sitting next to, Motley? Benjamin Franklin from Philadelphia. Now, the preamble to the Constitution, and then the lyrics to James Weldon Johnson's "Lift Every Voice and Sing," then the preamble to the Gettysburg Address in its entirety, and then the Apostles' Creed. And every day for 2 years, the recitations rolled as sweetly and poetically from my lips as to the ears of these ladies who were stewarding those ideas. And I guess you've deduced that I became a rabbit again. Everyone in the community had some role and responsibility. My grandfather had organized the farmers on our street and Mr. Van, a plumber, to drive me to the Montgomery Public Library every Saturday. And every Saturday, you know, you understand history more fully and completely when you're able to look through the rearview mirror of life. Things just become a bit clear. And only now do I fully appreciate that these men from Madison Park, every Saturday, driving me to the Montgomery Public Library on Dexter Avenue, unable themselves to ever go into that public library, but seeing me climb those stairs, going into this wonderful cathedral of ideas. And on one occasion, my grandfather drove me in his Chevrolet Impala, parked outside. It was a July afternoon, and I went in. Everyone in the library knew me, and I would build these wonderful pyramids of books. And I would just copy, and I would copy, and I would copy. And I looked up on this one occasion, and there was an elderly white gentleman sitting in a wheelchair with a black attendant at his side turning pages. And I would look up, and he would look down. And I would look down, and he would look up. And every now and then, we would catch each other's gaze. And 2 hours later, the librarian came over to me, and she said, "All right, Motley boy, time to gather up your books, time to leave." And the gentleman stared at me for a very long time and nodded as if he was affirming something. I descended the stairs. I went back out to my grandfather. My grandfather, sitting in the car for 2 hours, too poor to afford air conditioning, sitting there writing in his little notebook, didn't turn on the radio, fearing that it would run down the battery. And he said, "Who did you meet today? Did you meet Mr. Wordsworth? What about Shakespeare? Tell me about Shakespeare." And I said, "Daddy, you would never believe who I met in the library today. Did you meet Mr. Frost, Robert Frost?" "No, Daddy, I met George Wallace, sitting across from me in the Montgomery Public Library." History is filled with ironies. American history is filled with ironies. And my grandfather in that moment decided to sit down and give me a history lesson, to tell me about the struggle of people throughout time, the struggle of African Americans in the South in the Civil Rights Movement. And here was a man with enormous decorum and Victorian sensibilities, who himself was a veteran of World War II, who went off to fight in a war under the commander-in-chief that he couldn't vote for, to drink from canteens knowing that he would come back home to Alabama and not be able to drink from water fountains in the public park. And yet he reminded me that all of this was done so that individuals like me could inherit the earth and could realize our life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that to whom much was given, much was required. Not bitter, not angry, fearing that he would imbue me with a sense of anger and discontent that would alter my own perspective of hope, but realistic and pragmatic. That's my grandfather's legacy and inheritance to me. Years later, I found myself at college. I went away and fast forwarded through college. I did fairly well and I got a scholarship. And the scholarship was to go anywhere in the world to study for 1 year upon my ability to get accepted into that university. Interestingly, I had fallen in love with Scotland. I don't know why. So I decided that I would apply to the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. And I ended up in Scotland. But right before I left to go to Scotland, after receiving the acceptance letter, I was greatly disturbed about the prospects of these grandparents who had reared me and had given everything so that I could grow and develop. And now they were in their 80s. And my sense of responsibility to them weighed extremely heavily. I was home from college that weekend from Sanford, and a gentleman phoned me by the name of William Winston, and he said, "I want to talk to you. I hear you're in town. I want you to meet me over at the cemetery." And you think, gosh, the cemetery, what a meeting place that is. But what I failed to tell you was that the retired teachers, Emma Madison Bell, Frankie Lee Madison Winston, Carrie Madison Say, Sarah Pearl Coleman, made a commitment with me that they would tutor me, but on every Saturday morning I had to go with them to the town cemetery, the Madison Park Cemetery, to help sweep away the pine straw that had fallen during the week, and to carry the mason jars and the milk containers of water so that we could put wildflowers on every grave in the cemetery. My principal responsibility was sweeping the graves. And it was there that this love affair with this place called Madison Park was inspired. It was there that I learned the names and stories of every person whose rest had been won in that place. I would sweep, and she would say, "You're sweeping on the grave of Emma Grain." Emma Grain was the first seamstress in Madison Park, and I would sweep just a bit harder. "And now you're sweeping the grave of Arthur Madison. He was the first black to ever go to college from Madison Park. He integrated Bowdoin College. That's in Maine. Do you know where Maine is?" And I would sweep even harder. "And now you're sweeping the grave of Eli Madison, the founder, who could read and who had a vision for this place." And all of their descendants were there. All their descendants were still the caretakers of this great legacy and heritage. And so it wasn't unusual that William Winston knew that I spent the most formative years of my life in this very special place in evidence of God's grace. And so I met him there. And in his very southern way, he said to me, "I hear you got a scholarship to go over the sea." He says, "You're one of the few that's not in the Army going over the sea." And it's where? And I said, it's Scotland. And he says, yeah. And I hear that you're hesitating. Why are you hesitating? And I said, well, you know, my folks are old now, and there's no person to take care of them. And William Winston said, have you not learned anything about community in this space? And he started to walk me over the graves. His mother, one of those tutors, Frankie Lee Madison. His aunt, Emma Madison Bell. And he started to remind me that their investment in my education was so that I could have the benefit of going where none of them could go, and that I was representing everyone in Madison Park by taking advantage of this great responsibility, and that to whom much was given, much was not expected, but much was required. You see, Aunt Shine, in that room where she tutored me once a week, would bring props. And one of the props that she would bring, next to Frederick Douglass's photograph that she would take out and put on an easel, was a copy of the 13th Amendment. Every day I looked at Frederick Douglass and a copy of the 13th Amendment. And William Winston was reminding me of the power of the investment of those who had gone before me. A legacy that is so strong and so beautiful that it's even hard to tell. And so it was on that day that I realized that the people of Madison Park were going to take care of my grandparents. A couple months later, I packed my suitcase. I was at home. I was saying goodbye to my grandparents. My grandmother came into the room and she said to me, okay, there's a lot of people outside. You need to go out. I opened the screen door and I went out, and all of Madison Park was standing in the backyard, or at least it felt that way. And as I opened the door, Mrs. Rosebud Hall, the maker of the red velvet cake in the town, started to sing, "Blessed be the tie that binds." The minister said a prayer. He gave me an envelope, $50 taken up by the people at the Baptist church, another $50 taken up by the people at our church, the Methodist church. And everyone started to sing with Rosebud, "Blessed be the tie." Until Aunt B went into her pocketbook and she made her way to the front of the crowd. She took out a map, she laid it across the hood of the car, and she said, "Now show us Scotland." And as I made my way through the crowd, and I got to the hood of the car, and I looked at the outstretched map, I realized that it was a map of Montgomery, Alabama. You see, she had never left Montgomery. Her parameters of the world were defined by the very place that she had lived all of her life. Most of the people that I knew in Madison Park, on my street for sure, had really probably never left Alabama except Detroit, when a great migration took place during the 1930s. And even then, I was reminded that I was going from Madison Park like an astronaut to outer space to a place that they couldn't even envision. And then the Cool Whip container of collard greens, just in case they don't have collards in Scotland, was that final affirmation. I went away to Scotland. I had a wonderful experience. It was a Rotary Ambassadorial Scholarship. And during my first year, I became so studious and so interested in continuing my education and not starting to work that I decided that I would enroll into a doctorate program somewhere. I looked at universities all across the US, and then one day, the president of the university, who had befriended me, came up to me at a garden party and said to me, "Let's have a conversation." His name was Sir Strother Arnott. And he was everything that you can think of when you think of British aristocracy. And Strother said to me, "Have you decided what you're going to do next once you end your master's degree? That's only in a couple of months." And I said, "Well, you know, I think I'll go back and maybe Woodrow Wilson School or the JFK School at Harvard, and I might want to go into public policy." And he looked at me with such enormous disgust. And he said to me, "How ill-prepared you are, and how unlike this is of you. You see, when I arrived at St. Andrews, the university president, who had given me the scholarship allowing me to be the first in my family to go to college, mentored me and introduced me to Greek literature and the world of ideas. And unbeknownst to me, he wrote a letter to the president of the University of St. Andrews saying, "This is a student. Let me tell you his family story. He wants to get an education. And should he have financial issues at any point along the way, I want to be the first to know, because we will cover whatever costs are needed." And so unbeknownst to me, Sir Strother Arnott took a sense of stewardship. And he said to me on that occasion, as only a white person living in Europe could do, "I want you to go back to your room tonight and think about your future and think about the investment that others have made in you. And then I want you to come back tomorrow and meet me for afternoon tea in the gazebo and tell me what your plans are. Because if you're interested in continuing your education and living into the fullness of the investment, then you'll think about what you want to do and not go back to America and be given an opportunity because of the pigment of your skin, but because of your intellectual credentials. So if you stay, I'll underwrite your PhD, but you have to decide what you want to do." Wow. It wasn't brain surgery to go back the next day to say to Strother, "I think I'll stay and do my PhD." A couple of weeks later, a classmate of mine, and I don't know if you've been to Scotland, I now work for the Aspen Institute, and so I spend the summers in Aspen, and it's not a very diverse place ethnically. Scotland, even more so. And so I was always mistaken for Tiger Woods everywhere I went. You know, Tiger Woods. I think I gave more autographs fictitiously. But a classmate of mine asked me if I was at all interested in going home one weekend with him. He wanted me to meet his mom. I had no interest in going home with Patty. He smoked about 10 cigarettes a day, and I thought it would be a nicotine nightmare. And eventually another classmate said to me, "I think you might want to go home with Patty one weekend. I think you might want to meet his parents." And most of my classmates' parents lived in London, but worked in Hong Kong or in some faraway place from the UK. And so in this particular instance, I knew that Patty's parents lived in Scotland, but primarily took residence in London, and that's all I knew. And so we're going to his house early one Saturday morning. We're driving through this wonderful lush countryside where J.M. Barrie wrote Peter Pan, Kerry Muir, Angus, Scotland. And we're passing these great estates, these wonderful castles, spires touching the heavens. And we pass by Glamis Castle, and we pass by Early Castle, and then we turn down this drive. And I turned to Patty and I said, "Patty, you know, where I'm from, it's against the law to trespass." And Patty said to me, "We're not trespassing. This is my family's house." And I just looked, and I tried to retain myself and contain myself not to say, you know, "Oh my God." And I said, "Oh, this is your family's house," as if this was quite common in Madison Park. And he said, no, that's the groundkeeper's cottage." And I went, yes, of course, the groundkeeper's cottage. Yes, I know the groundkeeper's cottage. And then we spiraled down this great path, meandering around this great moat, and we came to this great castle sitting back with sheep grazing. And I just heard in my mind Handel's "He Shall Feed His Flock." And we came up to the house. Patty got out quickly. Attendants came out in kilts. They helped us with our luggage. Patty went inside to use the restroom. I was amazed by the number of flags flying over the castle, and I turned to the valet and I said to him, "Excuse me, I know the Union Jack and I know the Scottish flag, but I don't recognize the other flags." And he said to me, "Well, that's Lord Patrick's." Lord Patrick. "This is Lord Patrick's father's office." And I said, "His father's office? And where might his office be?" And he goes, "Well, his office is, he's the Earl of Airlie." I went, yes, the Earl of Airlie. And he said, "You know, he is Lord Ogilvy." Lord Ogilvy, the Earl of Airlie. "Wonderful. And what do I call him? Lord or Airlie or..." And he said, "You call him Lord Ogilvy, but he is the Earl of Airlie. So you could call him Lord Ogilvy or Lord Airlie. You choose." And Patty's mom is the Countess of Airlie. She is Lady Ogilvy. Or you could call her Lady Airlie. But she'll probably tell you to call her Jenny. And I said, "And the other flag?" well, that's Patrick's father's royal responsibilities. And I said, the royal responsibilities, and tell me what the royal responsibilities are. Father's the Lord Chamberlain to Her Majesty the Queen. So, translation, mother is the lady of the bedchamber to the Queen, father is Lord Chamberlain, they're the second cousins of the Queen, and they live in Buckingham Palace. Okay, I got it. And so that weekend was the U.S. ambassador taking residence, and Sir Evelyn de Rothschild and his wife, Lady Victoria, and Eric Motley. And someone asked me, and where are you from? And I said, Madison Park. And they went, yes, Madison Park. Is that on the other side of Hyde Park? And I said, no, that's not in London. I'm sorry. That's in Alabama. About 5 weeks later, Patty's mother invites me to a garden party, and it just happens to be the Queen's annual garden party. And it was quite a spectacular event. And I show up, and it's tails, and I invited a classmate of mine who I thought knew these protocols to join me, but what I didn't know was that she had a wonderful addiction to champagne. And so, as we're at the garden party and the trumpets sound and the Queen comes out, and we start to sing what I thought was My Country 'Tis of Thee, which uncreatively is really my God Save the Queen, the lady in waiting comes and she finds me in the crowd as we're standing erect, waiting for this great promenade, and informs me that I'll be introduced. And the lady standing next to me is quite taken by the fact that I'm being introduced and she's trying to figure out who I am. And at the very end, my date, having had a little too much champagne, overhears the lady ask her husband, and who is he? And she replies, and don't you know the ambassador of Nigeria when you see him? And the lady turned and she said, Your Excellency. And so in the course of a couple years, I bore the identity of Tiger Woods and the ambassador to Nigeria. And then I had the opportunity to come back to the U.S. And as good fortune would have it, I found myself working in the White House. And I never will forget, because there are memories that will always stand out, I never will forget the day that I was going through those gates and I was asked to show my credentials. And I felt like all of Madison Park was with me. A couple of days later, we were given an orientation, and I was assigned to the Office of Presidential Personnel within the White House. And my boss, looking at my resume and flipping all the pages, said to me, well, it's evident that you know a lot about Plato and Aristotle, but it seems like we're missing a page here, like employment history. And I said, well, point of clarification, I've not had a job before because I left my undergraduate studies and went into a master's program and then went into a PhD program. And he looked at me quite assuredly and he said, yes, well, you won't be needing a lot of Plato and Aristotle here, but nothing is brain surgery except brain surgery. And so everything that you need to know, we could teach you. And it's evident that you're a quick learner. And a couple of days later, I found myself in the Oval Office. And as I was going in a George Bush type of way, brand new to the staff, I'm 27 years old, it's about 4 weeks into the job, President looks at the Chief of Staff, then he looks at my boss, and then he looks at me, and he says, you're already in here? And then my boss turned and he said, I want to introduce you to Eric Motley. Eric Motley is new to our team. And the president says, yeah, from Scotland, right? Scotland from Alabama. That's not Alabama in Scotland, that's Alabama, right? I've heard about you. Margaret Tutwiler told me about your grandparents, about the town that you grew up in, about the investment of all the people in that space. You can't let them down. You can't let them down. It's not about you. It's about the job that you've been given. It's not about you. It's about the people you're representing. They believed in you. We believe in you. What an affirmation. And week after week, for 20 minutes in the Oval Office, for 4 years, the president would catch me gazing at a portrait. Abraham Lincoln. And I was always mindful of the fact that my grandfather, in his coming and going from his grandfather's house, in those early years, would enter the house, the cross hovering over him, and looking head on to the image of Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator. We're all a part of an inescapable network of mutuality. We're tied in a single garment of destiny. In 2011, my grandmother died, and David Brooks, who's a friend who writes for the New York Times, helps me to remember that one of the most significant details of the entire narrative that I write about in Madison Park, all these people, the incidents, the accidents, the providence of life, is the fact that my grandmother died and I decided to sell the house. One of the hardest decisions I've ever made. I live in Washington, D.C. I'm single. It's a 2-acre estate. And so I phoned a real estate agent, and she came to meet with me. And as we're sitting on the back porch, we went through the entire rigmarole of all the questions that real estate agents ask you. Montgomery, Alabama. And she said, "Honey, are there any ghosts in this house?" And I said, "I don't think there are ghosts in this house." And she says, "Have anybody died in this house?" And I said, "John Wesley Motley died in this house. John Baptiste Motley died in this house. James Fawcett Motley died in this house. George Washington Motley almost died in this house. But 3 weeks ago, my grandmother, Mamie Motley, died in this house." And she said, "This house got so many ghosts." And I said, is that a negative? And she says, "Honey, that's a positive." People have lived here. And what was so interesting and yet so entertaining was that it was the second time in the history of Madison Park that a house had ever gone on the market. And David Brooks reminds me that there are people in this country and places in this country where people never leave. The farm is passed on to them. The land is passed on. And from one generation to the next, they inherit the space. And all across Madison Park, the descendants are still there, even today. The children that I grew up with are still there, manning the farms, taking care of the family's business. The undertakers, the plumbers. There was a bidding war on 34 Motley Drive, and the real estate agent asked how I wanted to engage in this. And I said, have people to write letters and tell me why they want to buy the house at 34 Motley Drive. Because I want my grandchildren to grow up in a house where your grandparents cared and loved you and made sacrifices and showed us all what living in community is about. And so why do I tell you the story of all these people in Madison Park? Because at the very end, what we realize is not only what I call REM, that's not rapid eye movement, but that's relationships, experiences, and memories. That's what we have at the very end. That is the composite of our total being, relationships, experiences, and memories. I tell you the story because the power of community, that calls us to rise above our individual interest and to make a commitment to others who live with us and around us, is still great. I tell you the story because when it's so easy to be disappointed and frustrated at the current state of things, when politics is really a scare, and we feel culturally confused, we can be reminded that there are institutions that still work, but they require each of us, every one of us, to participate, to be called into the fullness of our being and into the fullness of the beings of those around us. Madison Park is not just a story about the black people who lived in this community that were descendants of the founders. Madison Park is also a story about the people that my grandmother cleaned houses for. Mrs. Peabody, who would send New York Times home because she thought it was the best reading in the world, who sent one day a crate of long-playing albums. And my grandfather said to me, "You choose an album and I'll get the radio, I'll get the record player, and we'll listen to records together." And I chose this wonderful record of this woman dressed in this Elizabethan costume. Little did I know at the time that it was Maria Callas. I'd never heard of Carmen. And yet it was the most melodious sonnet that I had ever heard. Totally alien and strange. I had heard Beatrice sing Amazing Grace at the local church, and for sure she hit some high octaves, but the vocal somersaults of Maria Callas was totally a new world to me. It was the white teacher who stayed after school every day for 2 years to help me in debate and to coach me in public address, who made a real investment. Not for any extra pay, not for accolades, but because she believed in the investment of others. And so Madison Park is not just a place. If you put it in your GPS system, the likelihood is that you won't find it. But Madison Park is an idea that is much larger than any individual person. It is an idea that calls each of us to realize that we have a role. It's an idea that calls each of us to reflect on Abraham Lincoln's own desire to emancipate and to create a life better. You will go into the next room and you will see the 13th Amendment. And you will see the names of all those congressmen and senators who signed it. But you will also recognize that there are those whose names do not appear. History will remember us for the responsibilities that we have and for the role that we choose to play. Reinhold Niebuhr, the great social philosopher, said that nothing that is worth doing could be accomplished in a lifetime. Therefore, we're saved by hope. Nothing that is good or beautiful makes complete sense in its immediate context of history. Therefore, we're saved by faith. Nothing, no matter how virtuous, could be accomplished alone. Therefore, we're saved by love. We're saved by community. Thank you. Thank you. I was told to reserve a little time for some Q&A, and I think we have about 10 minutes, so I'm willing to undergo your drill. One question that you're not asking me that I'm always asked is why write this memoir? And I don't think of it as a memoir because memoir seems kind of pretentious, like I've lived so much of life that I have something to say. It's really a love story about a place and a people who will never see their names in print. And I wanted to do that. And I wanted to celebrate them in their story and their dreams and hopes. But I also have a lot of friends who are writers. And there was a great chorus line of writers who, in the last couple of years, wrote about what's wrong with America and what's broken. And there was a lot of hopelessness. And I think amidst all of our hopelessness and our frustrations and our anger and our discontent and our being reminded of everything that is broken, here lies a beautiful story about what works. What once worked, what worked again in the 1960s during Jim Crow law, and what works now. And if you ask me what was Madison Park like today, I go back at least twice a year. And the sense of community that I enjoyed when I was there as a child is the same sweet, sacred bonds that bind the citizens together today. No one gets out alive. Everyone is tied together. And so I wanted to tell that story. And for sure, I am aware of the narratives that we should all be aware of that are so disheartening. I didn't grow up in the inner city. I can't tell that story. I didn't grow up in a housing project. I can't tell that story. I grew up on a farm, a very Thoreauan upbringing. The Madison Park Creek was my Walden. And I grew up with neighbors knowing your name and your stories and people going to church together and believing there was some higher being. That's the story that I could tell. Mark Twain said that history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. And so we got to decide what part of that sonnet we're going to write out and how we manifest it.
Did you ultimately decide to sell the house to the best letter that you received?
I did.
What was in the letter that caused you to...
The letter was of a grandfather who had this granddaughter. And he wrote saying that he would sell his house, which was a nice house, to buy a smaller house, even if it were not in Madison Park, so that he could buy the Motley house and give it to his daughter who was growing up alone as a single mother with this child. And it took me a very long time, I have to confess. I go back at least twice a year now to lay flowers on the graves. I have no living relatives there, but the entire town is a part of my family. And I go back and I visit those who are still alive and visit my childhood friends. And it took me at least 4 years to walk down Motley Drive and to visit the neighbors on both sides of our house and not put my foot on the lawn to pick a pecan or a flower from the gardenia bush that my grandmother. Tom Wolfe said, and it's Heraclitus once said it, you can't step in the stream in the same place. Tom Wolfe said, you can't go home again. And that romantic idea as espoused by William Wordsworth, you know, the rainbow comes and goes and lovely as a rose, and this I know where'er I go, that there has passed away a glory from the earth. You can't do a repeat. And so I could romantically go back, and I go back, but at the same time, I'm even more aware of what's not there. And I'm also aware that now there's a little girl growing up in that house. And that is far more affirming of legacy than my being a very, very bad landlord.
Did Madison Park, was it incorporated? Was it a neighborhood? What was it?
It was incorporated, and even on the map in Montgomery, Alabama, it was Madison Park. And Madison Park, where I grew up, at least in Madison Park, we were barely in the city limits. The city limits sign that said the end of city limits was only about 7 houses from where I grew up. And so we were just a little enclave on the periphery. But I'm convinced the interesting stuff happens on the periphery, you know? Yes, ma'am?
You said that you don't have any living relatives in Madison Park. You don't consider, what happened to the other 13 children that were your mother's family?
Yes, you're right. They're still there, not all of them. Those that are there, I didn't grow up. Madison Park is not a large place. They didn't live on our street. I have wonderful relationships. I stay with one of them when I go back. They are still there. They're cousins. But I have to confess, this is the more stoic side of me. In Madison Park, everyone was considered a cousin. And I had a grandmother and a grandfather, and I had a mother. And later I got a sibling, many years later, but she didn't grow up in Madison Park because my mother moved away. And I view everybody in Madison Park as a cousin. And so I ended up growing up with my biological cousins' children as cousins of the community. And that's no less. It's just I'm all the richer for having more cousins. I want to put a footnote to that interesting marginal comment. Interestingly, one of the retired teachers in Madison Park, Princella Madison, who was the longest living of those 4 retired teachers, died about 3 years ago. She was 104 years old. And she was the longest living citizen of Madison Park. And she was one of the most refined ladies I had ever met. She always wore gloves on Sunday. I never saw her not wearing a dress. She taught me elocution. Everything about her was just Jane Austen-esque. And right before she died, the city decided to take an audit of the town cemetery, and they discovered that we had perhaps overburied, that we were beyond the capacity burying in that cemetery. And maybe there were 3 or maybe 20 or maybe 40 too many people in that town cemetery, and it becomes a health and hazard concern. And so they had to pore over all the county records, and this took a while. And so they put a moratorium on burying people in the cemetery. And about 2 months later, Aunt Princella dies. And this is sad, but, you know, funny at the same time. She dies, and she can't be buried in the Madison Park Cemetery. The last person bearing the name Madison, 104 years old, and there were no allowances until this audit had been completed. And so I'm invited to go back to deliver the eulogy. I go back, I arrive, the church is packed, rightly so, and there's an urn on the table at the altar. And everyone's sitting there and everyone's looking at the urn. Aunt Princella had to be cremated. It was the first time in the history of Madison Park that anyone had been cremated. And everyone's sitting there, and on the front row, sitting in a chair next to the urn, is Aunt Murtis. We call her Aunt Murtis. She's not a biological aunt. And I said, Aunt Murtis, why are you sitting here? And why so close? And she says, honey. And I looked even closer, and I realized that there was tape, duct tape, around the top lid of this urn. And I said, Aunt Murtis? And she said, honey, everybody's been trying to look in. They're trying to see her. And I said, oh my God. And she says, that's why they're all here. They're just staring. They've been coming up. They've been touching it. They've been trying to distract me. They want to see her. And it dawned on me, well, of course, you know, no one had ever seen anything except a coffin in this church, in this town, all these years. And so she sat there, and then she leaned over to me and she said, and the bad thing is that she's not in there. And I said, of course she's not in there. She goes, no, not even the ashes. There's a long wait at the city morgue, you know? And one of the most beautiful things is that about 6 or 7 months later, because you're asking me about family and community and the ties that bind me to this place, the city completed its audit, and they decided that there's space for about 10 more people in Madison Park. 7 descendants of Eli Madison still live, and they're in their 80s and 90s. And then I received this letter, and the letter informs me that the citizens of Madison Park voted to reserve a place for me at home between my grandparents. And in my desk drawer at the Aspen Institute, I keep this letter because it's a beautiful reminder that I will always have a place in Madison Park. And whether or not I ever choose, or I get married, or whoever chooses where I should be, I know that in between my grandparents, among all of my family, I will too have a place to rest and will forever call it my home. Thank you very much. Thank you.